Hello everyone, this is Corsair Mack with Mack's Empowerment Counseling LLC. And today we're going to be going over a little bit more of the history of mental health in the Black community. So last year, during Black History Month at my other place of employment, I did a presentation called The History of Mental Health in the Black Community, Overcoming 4 Centuries of Stress, Trauma, and Drama. So we are going to be pulling a little bit from that, not the specific presentation, but the specific information that I found. Alright, so sit back, relax, take everything I say with a grain of salt, do your own research, and enjoy the video. Alright, so ultimately, what did I talk about? So basically, I talked about a lot of different things that contributed to mental health in the Black community. Right, so I talked about the William Lynch letter. I talked about different things that happened during the 1600s and 1700s in relation to Black Americans and Africans that came over from Africa. Right, and I also talked about things that are happening now currently in the 20th century. Right, and really taking a look to see the different patterns and how things are tied together to essentially what we see here today. Alright, so I'm not going to do that whole thing because that will take a really long time. I'm just going to take a look at specific things that you guys might find interesting. Alright, so let's take a look. Alright, so let's take a look at this first one. Alright, so when I did my presentation, one of the main places I started doing my research was this, and I really branched out to really take a look to see what I could find. So Dr. Ume, I really hope I'm pronouncing her name right, wrote this article below, and we're just going to read a little bit from it to start off this conversation. Right? In 1848, John Galt, a physician and medical director of the Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg, Virginia, offered that blacks are immune to mental illness. Galt hypothesized that enslaved Africans could not develop mental illness because, as enslaved people, they did not own property, engage in commerce, or participate in civic affairs such as voting or holding office. This immunity hypothesis assumed, according to Galt and others at the time, that the risk of lunacy would be highest in those populations who were emotionally exposed to the stress of profit-making, principally wealthy white men. Right, and I'm going to skip over this part here, as well as that part there. If you guys want to read it, I'll put a link in the description. But the main thing I wanted to get to was this part right here. Okay. Mental illness has been in existence as long as humans have inhabited the earth, but for people of African descent, little or no reference are available about this condition before the 1700s. Dr. Benjamin Rush, the leading medical authority in the nation during the years immediately following the American Revolution, was also the most prominent medical practitioner to disagree with John Galt's idea about the absence of mental illness among black slaves. When he wrote that many of the enslaved suffered from abnormal behaviors, including, well, I won't say that word, which he described as the irrational desire by blacks to become white. Since becoming white can only be accomplished by miscegenation, Rush argued against intermarriage between races to ensure that that word would not spread beyond the black population. While there was no indication that he ever treated anyone for this disease, he noted in one of his writings that Africans become insane, soon after they enter upon the toils of perpetual slavery in the West Indies. Other antebellum medical researchers promoted conditions such as drapetomania, a disease that caused enslaved blacks to flee their plantations, or dysphagia in Ethiopia, a disease that purportedly caused a state of dullness and lethargy, which would now be considered depression. Modern historians of slavery have described both conditions as understandable responses to enslavement, but white medical practitioners at the time assumed they were manifestations of mental illness. Right? Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a pro slavery physician who worked with enslaved people in Louisiana, argued that severe whippings was typically the best treatment for both conditions. Cartwright and others often reported that tryptomania and dysphagia Ethiopia were often accompanied by skin lesions, which historians now argued were most likely scars from whippings. In other words, these physicians failed to recognize the connection between the emotional state of the enslaved and the treatment recommended for their conditions. All right, I'm going to stop there, and we're going to really take a look at those two terms. All right, so I know Wikipedia isn't a place people would normally get their information from, though based off the research that I did, and also they have the references down here if anybody wants to go and take a look at them, as well as their sources if anyone wants to go take a look at them. And we might take a look at this one later, but if anyone wants to take a look at them, there they are. Alright, so trichotillomania was considered a conjectural mental illness that, in 1851, American physician Samuel A. Cartwright hypothesized as the cause of enslaved Africans fleeing captivity. In actuality, the desire for freedom is a natural human impulse. Cartwright specifically citing the tendency to flee the plantations that held the subjects in slavery in evidence for why would slaves, happy with their condition, seek to flee. To these physicians, such people had to be sick, impervious to the natural order of things. He published an article about black slaves' illnesses and idiosyncrasies in a widely circulated Southern journal. Contemporarily reprinted in the South, Cartwright's article was widely mocked and satirized in the northern United States. The concept has since been debunked as pseudoscience and shown to be part of the edifice of scientific racism. Alright, and then the term from the Greek word, where you see what that is, and then as late as 1914, the third edition of Thomas Lathrop Stedman's Practice of Medical Dictionary included an entry for trichotillomania defined as vagabondage, dromomania, an uncontrollable or insane impulse to wander. Alright, let's take a look at the description. Cartwright described the disorder, which he said was unknown to our medical authorities, although it is diagnosed symptom. The absconding from service is well known to our planters and overseers. In a paper delivered before the Medical Association of Louisiana that was widely reprinted, he stated that the malady, I probably misinterpreted that word, so I apologize, was a consequence of masters who made themselves too familiar with slaves, treating them as equals. Let's see what this next part says. If treated kindly, well fed and clothed, with fuel enough to keep a small fire burning all night, separated into families, each family having its own house, not permitted to run about at night, to visit their neighbors, to receive visits, or use intoxicating liquors, and not overworked or exposed too much to the weather, they are very easily governed, more so than any other people in the world. If any one or more of them at any time are inclined to raise their heads to a level with their master or overseer, humanity and their own good requires that they should be punished until they fall into that submissive state which was intended for them to occupy. They have only been kept in that state and treated like children to prevent and cure them from running away. In diseases and peculiarities of the Negro race, Cartwright says that the Bible calls for a slave to be submissive to his master, and by doing so, the slave will have no desire to run away. If the white man attempts to oppose the deity's will by trying to make the Negro anything else than submissive knee-bender, which the Almighty declared he should be, by trying to raise him to a level with himself, or by putting himself on an equality with the Negro, or if he abuses the power which God has given him over his fellow man by being cruel to him, or punishing him in anger, or by neglecting to protect him from the wanton abuse of his fellow servants and all others, or by denying him the usual comforts and necessaries of life, the Negro will run away. But if he kept him in the position that we learn from the scriptures he was intended to occupy, that is, the position of submission, and if his master or overseers be kind and gracious in his bearing toward him, without condescension, and at the same time ministers to his physical wants and protects him from abuse, the Negro is spellbound and cannot run away. All right, and then prevention and remedy. In addition to identifying trichotillomania, his feeling was that with proper medical advice, strictly followed this troublesome practice that many Negroes have running away can be almost entirely prevented. In the case of slaves, sulky and dissatisfied with the cause, a warning sign of immediate flight, Cartwright mentioned whipping the devil out of them as a preventative measure. All right, and then contemporary. While Cartwright's article was reprinted in the South, in the northern United States, it was widely mocked. A satirical analysis of the article appeared in the Buffalo Medical Journal editor in 1855. Renowned landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, in A Journey in Seaboard Slave States, observed that white indentured servants have often been known to flee as well. So he satirically hypothesized that the supposed disease was actually of white European origin and had been introduced to Africa by traders. All right, so some reactions to this. This was very, very interesting, right? Ultimately, when we take a look at this, first, when I first read it, my mind was blown. I was like, wow, that was pretty bad, right? Noting that a mental illness caused enslaved Africans and enslaved African Americans and Black Americans to flee captivity, when in reality they were just being treated really, really bad, and people wanted to get away from that. So ultimately, and then also with them using the Bible to justify slavery as well, something that we'll touch on if I get back to making or remaking my video about the whites only church in Minnesota. Ultimately, it's horrible, to say the least. It's horrible. Thankfully, we have come a long way since then, though ultimately that doesn't exclude the fact that back then what happened was extremely horrible. And ultimately, when we take a look at it, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, right, we talk about institutionalization. A lot of people believe institutionalization only relates to prisons and things like that, but ultimately, institutionalization relates to a lot of different things. And I'll show you guys the definition in a little bit. Ultimately, it talks about the norm in different institutions and cultures, right? And this was the norm back then. Right? This was seen as normal, and this was seen as right, and this was seen as justified. Right? By going against it, you were seen as weird, right? Not normal, right? So on and so forth. But let's get back to the other mental illness. All right, let's take a look at dysesthesia aethiopica. All right, in psychiatry, dysesthesia aethiopica, bad feelings of Ethiopians, was an alleged mental illness described by American physician Samuel A. Cartwright in 1851, which proposed a theory for the cause of laziness among slaves. Today, dysesthesia aethiopica is considered an example of pseudoscience and a part of the edifice of scientific racism. All right, let's take a look at the history. Found exclusively among African Americans, dysesthesia aethiopica, called by overseers rascality, was characterized by partial insensitivity of the skin and so great a habitude of the intellectual faculties as to be like a person half asleep. Other symptoms include lesions of the body discoverable to the medical observer, which are always present and sufficient to account for the symptoms. Cartwright contended that the existence of Dysesthesia Dysesthesia aethiopica was clearly established by the most direct and positive testimony, but other doctors had failed to notice it because their attention had not been sufficiently directed to the maladies of the Negro race. Cartwright felt that dysphasia aethiopica was easily curable if treated on sound psychological principles. Insensitivity of the skin was one symptom of the disease, so the skin should be stimulated. The best means to stimulate skin is first to have the patient well washed with warm water and soap, then to anoint it all over in oil, and to slap the oil in with a broad leather strap. Oh. Then to put the patient to some hard kind of work in the sunshine. Wow. Arthur Vanessa Jackson has noted the lesions were a symptom of that word, and the ever resourceful Dr. Cartwright determined that whipping could cure this disorder. Of course, one wonders if the whippings were not the cause of the lesions that confirmed the diagnosis. According to Cartwright, after the prescribed course of treatment, the slave will look grateful and thankful to the white man whose compulsory power has restored his sensation and dispelled the mist that clouded his intelligence. According to Cartwright, that word was much more prevalent among free Negroes living in clusters by themselves than among slaves on our plantations, and attacks only such slaves as living like free Negroes in regard to diet, drinks, exercise, etc. Indeed, according to Cartwright, nearly all free Negroes are more or less afflicted with it that have not got some white person to direct and to take care of them. He explicitly dismissed the opinion which assigned the causes of the problematic behavior to the social situation of the slaves without further justifications. The Northern physicians ignorantly attributed the symptoms to the debasing influence of slavery on the mind. That, and then, of course, you have your references and your sources down here. All right, so let's go back. First let me react to that. Ultimately, that's very hard to read. It is, but ultimately, when you take a look at it, one of the cures was to lather oil, then beat the oil in with leather straps or whip them, and then after that, place them out in the sunlight to do labor to help with it. It's like, what was going through the minds of those people? But ultimately, we know what's going through those minds. Again, when we talk about institutionalization, and again, I'll show you the definition after this, but when we talk about institutionalization, right, that was the norm. The norm was to keep Africans and Black Americans enslaved. So we're going to use whatever science or what have you to justify that, right? It's like we talked about the one earlier, they utilized the Bible to justify it, and in this one they utilize psychology, psychiatry, and science to keep them enslaved. So ultimately, like I mentioned, that was the norm back then, and people believed it. So then, next, let's take a look at a couple of different things, and then we'll go on to final thoughts. All right, so here is the definition of institutionalization according to the Oxford Languages. The action of establishing something as a convention or norm in an organization or culture. But ultimately, like when people talk about institutionalization, they usually look at the second definition, right? The state of being placed or kept in a residential institution. But ultimately, when we talk about institutionalization in regards to mental health, we take a look at something in the mind, keeping something as normal, right? Keeping something as basically it's okay to do, and justifying that in the mind, saying even though it may look bad, it may sound bad, it may be bad, it's okay, it's normal. Things are supposed to happen that way. All right, so then we take a look at institutionalization, right, we take a look at this next one right here, which is the immunity hypothesis. All right, so when we take a look at something that's institutionalized or something that's normed, we got to take a look at this next thing called the immunity hypothesis. All right, so I'll start reading from here, and then of course Dr. Davis did this research and wrote this article. This is another thing that I took a look at from the American Psychiatric Association. So let's take a look at it. The proportionate number of slaves who become deranged is less than that of free colored persons and less than that of whites. For many of the causes affecting the other classes of our inhabitants, they are somewhat exempt. For example, they are removed from much of the mental excitement to which the free population of the Union is necessarily exposed in the daily routine of life. Again, they have not the anxious cares and anxieties relative to property, which tend to depress some of our free citizens. And that's from John Galt. All right. In 2020, the Commonwealth of Virginia will acknowledge the 150th anniversary of the first mental institution for blacks in America and the theoretical and political roots that marked its segregationist origins. In this article, I will discuss changes in the causal theories, legislation, and public opinion in Virginia that link blackness, mental illness, lunacy, dependency, and dangerousness as the predictive aftermath of slavery. It was this combination of sentiments, fear, and experiences that contributed to long-term differences in mental health care, excess admission rates, severe diagnoses, treatment, delayed help seeking. In addition, this article describes current efforts to retain, restore, and increase access to the 800,000 historical documents that describe the histography of this unique institution and thousands of people who were admitted. The immunity hypothesis. Historically, concepts of race and mental illness have been intimately linked in American psychiatry, policies, and public opinion. Started in the 1700s, the two diametrically opposed medical views were alternatively used to predict vulnerability of black population. From 1700 to 1840, enslaved blacks were described as immune to mental illness. John Galt, MD, medical director at Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg, Virginia, hypothesized that enslaved Africans were immune from the risk of mental illness because they did not own property, engage in commerce, or participate in such civic affairs as voting or holding public office. The immunity hypothesis assumed that the risk of lunacy would be highest in those populations who were emotionally exposed to the stress of profit-making, principally wealthy white men. Controversy over the 1840 census may have helped influence the passage of legislation in Virginia that allowed enslaved Africans qualified admission to Eastern Lunatic Asylum. 3 conditions were included in the legislation that circumscribed their admission. 1. No enslaved Africans could be admitted without a petition from their owner or persons who held jurisdiction over them. 2. The petitioner had to pay for the inpatient care of the enslaved. And 3. The admission of enslaved person cannot deny admission or treatment opportunities for white residents. From 1765 to 1868, fewer than 100 freed or enslaved blacks were legally allowed admission to Eastern Lunatic Asylum. Findings from the 1840 census purported to show that freed blacks in northern cities experienced significant higher rates of mental illness than enslaved blacks in the South. However, this conclusion failed to acknowledge that mental institutions in the South were restricted by law from admitting slaves. The purportedly higher rates of mental illness in northern states were attributed in the inability of blacks to manage freedom and their repeated efforts to escape slavery by migrating to northern states was characterized as pathological. Race-specific symptoms and hybrids diagnosis, for example, drapetomania, were coined to explain predictions of exponential increases in incidence and danger from idle black men if freed. In 1848, the Association for Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane appointed Virginia's two medical superintendents, Galt and Francis Stribling, MD, to develop a report to inform and guide public policy on race and mental illness. Galt believed that there was no medical rationale for separating people with mental illness by race, although he agreed that slaves should be excluded. After state legislation was passed in 1848, Galt provided admission to enslaved blacks if their owners paid for their care. Stribling, the superintendent at Western Lunatic Asylum in Stoughton, Virginia, opposed the admission and treatment of blacks in his asylum. Despite the differences, the 1848 report written by Galt and Stribling recommended that the states adopt a policy to segregate asylums by race. By 1865, Stribling's proposal that Virginia develop a separate hospital for blacks was consistent with the exploitation of the Freedmen's Bureau. Segregation quickly became national policy, which may have influenced the quality of mental health care for blacks in the 20th century. The exaggerated risk hypothesis. Blacks could receive care until the immunity hypothesis was displaced. Or blacks couldn't receive care until the immunity hypothesis was displaced. I think that's a typo there. Regrettably, the exaggerated risk hypothesis predicted excess mental illness, dependency, and dangerousness of black people if slavery were abolished. From 1860 into the 20th century, free blacks were seen as the greatest risk of mental illness. This causes included poverty, urban living, adverse family structures, and migration. The exaggerated risk hypothesis supported increased hospitalization of blacks as a means of control and safety. All right, the Central Lunatic Asylum for Coloredly Insane. After the end of the Civil War, Howard's Grove Hospital near Richmond provided limited health and welfare services for newly freed slaves. But in 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau negotiated with Virginia legislators to accept that hospital as the first mental health asylum for blacks in America. The opening of the Central Lunatic Asylum for Colored Insane was based on the prediction that thousands of newly freed black people needed mental health care. Rates of admissions and frequency of severe diagnosis at Central Lunatic Asylum increased significantly in patterns that supported dire predictions of rapid illness. From the 1870s to 1899, the number of admissions increased almost sixfold. However, most significant increases came during the Depression years when close to 10,000 people were admitted, compared with 1,200 in the preceding 2 decades. Alright, so when we take a look at these things, the immunity hypothesis and the exaggerated hypothesis, or exaggerated risk hypothesis, again, we talk about institutionalization. Stereotypes of Africans and black Americans that were captured and brought over here were widely believed back in, right? They were considered norm, natural, so on and so forth. And like I mentioned, white Americans at the time were willing to do anything they can to keep them enslaved or subjugated. Right, of course, when I say white Americans at the time, I don't mean all white Americans, right? Because of course there were white Americans there that did their best to help out black Americans, as well as slaves and things like that. Ultimately, though, when we really take a look at it, again, institutionalization. This was the norm back then. The norm was to be racist. The norm was to segregate white people and black people. The norm was to keep black people down. Right, that was the norm, that was the mindset, because again, in that mindset, black people were less than, right? Even before it was written in the 3/5 rule, black people were seen as less than second-class citizens. They weren't even seen as human. And that mindset is a dangerous one, because ultimately, if we don't see someone as human, then ultimately we won't treat them as human, right? We'll treat them as animals, we'll treat them as if they're expendable, right? We'll treat them horribly. And that's something we want to really get around. So ultimately, let me do one more thing and then I'll end with final thoughts. All right, I was trying to find writings for Dr. Cartwright, but the ones that I was doing a quick search for said that I need to log in. So I'm going to have to do more research, and I'll probably just make a part 2 of this video. But ultimately, my final thoughts, yes, thankfully we have came a long way. Unfortunately, we're not there just yet. Right? True, mental health is one of the more progressive fields out there. Ultimately, though, even though it's still one of the most progressive fields out there, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Ultimately, though, it all comes down to the mindset, right? That those norms that we believed back then that are still being pushed to this day, right? The stereotypes that we believe that are still being pushed to this day, and other things like that. But ultimately, when we take a look at it, first things first, we got to understand where we came from to know where we're going. And if we understand we came from a racist past, we know that we can go towards a not racist future because, again, we won't repeat the mistakes of the past, right? We learn from them and keep moving forward. Same thing with mental health. I know that, even now in the year 2022, there's still a majority of black people that are misdiagnosed with schizophrenia, right? And other more major mental health illnesses when it's just regular depression and anxiety. Yes, we are learning from our mistakes and moving forward, but ultimately, we are not there 100% yet. And a lot of people wonder, what is 100%, right? How do we get there? And I think I guess in my opinion, the answer is obvious. It may not happen in my lifetime, but first things first, we have to end racism 100%, right? We have to end that mindset. So that way those norms or those things that were seen as norms in the past and are still seen as norms in some parts of the United States today don't get passed down to the next generation. But ultimately, yeah, that is about it. So if you like the video, please feel free to like. If you want to see me comment on something or give the mental health aspect on something, please let me know. Other than that, all the links will be in the description of what I read from, so that way you guys can take a look at it and make up your own mind, because ultimately my opinion shouldn't dictate your thoughts, feelings, and opinions and beliefs. So again, this is Courser Mack with Mack's Empowerment Counseling LLC, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.